Good afternoon, good evening, church family and friends. Pastor Sam again for our Wednesday evening musings with the pastor. Last week we kind of started a musings study, if you will, on Nehemiah and the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. Nehemiah, of course, was the wine taster. He was a Jew, probably from the tribe of Judah, but found himself as a wine taster for the kings of Prussia. Now, that was a very important position. What that really meant was that before the kings ate or tasted anything, the wine taster would try it first, and if there was any poison, of course, it was a sort of a first wall, if you will, pun intended, first wall of protection to keep the kings from being killed by poisoning. Their job was not only just to taste and eat the first bites or drinks of the food and wine, but also to ensure that there was no foul play, to make sure that the food preparation and the wine preparation and everything was in accordance with rules and regulations and what have you, and safety protocols. We're all familiar with that, safety protocols that would ensure that the food and that the wine was in fact safe. So here we have Nehemiah very content in the palace, the winter palaces of the kings of Prussia, and doing quite well actually. And he gets a visit from his brother Hanani. So old Hanani comes and informs Nehemiah that the walls of Jerusalem have been destroyed and were in a state of disrepair. You know, we talked last week about walls and what walls mean, and we agreed that not so much a methodology of keeping things or people out or things or people in, but in some cases just a means of defining space. And so we wanted to take that notion and listen to and discern some things about Nehemiah and the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem in the context of a broader picture of perhaps walls that define who we are as Christians, walls that define who we are as individuals, walls that define the space in which we live and have our being. And there's some very interesting side notes, I think, that as I have studied this, that take place with regard to Nehemiah's call, if you will, his call into this very problematic and yet very important mission to rebuild the walls. Basically, we're left to believe that he is unaware that the walls are in a bad state of repair or in no state of repair whatsoever. His brother comes and reminds him, and here's the interesting thing. Selwyn Hughes, the author of our devotion, puts it this way. It says, Nehemiah's strong reaction to this news shows us where his real concerns lay. Nehemiah sits right next to the king. Very important position. It says it reveals his real concerns, not in maintaining a good position in the Persian Empire, but rather in achieving God's purposes for his holy city. You see, immediately Nehemiah is struck with this emotional response that I think we all have sometimes. And I would encourage us to kind of discern what is our emotional response of things that are going on in our own lives, things that are happening, that our emotional response to us could be a foretelling, if you will, an opening, if you will, of God using us through our emotions to put action to our emotions. This is what happens to Nehemiah. Nehemiah hears of the walls being in a bad state of repair, and he begins to weep. He's overwhelmed with sorrow, and he begins to weep at the walls and the need for the walls. I mean, here's the holy city of Jerusalem in a state of disrepair. Now, there had been some elements of the city that had been restored, but the walls have not. The walls were the defining elements of the city that gave definition to exactly what the city was, the holy city of God. And so Nehemiah is overwhelmed with sadness and sorrow, and so that provokes action. That provokes action on Nehemiah's part. It says that he sat down and wept. One of the things that Selwyn Hughes brings out is sometimes the first thing we need to do in a crisis situation or in a problem in our lives or whatever is to understand and face that problem. Sometimes we can just ignore. We bury our heads in the sand and we ignore an emotional response that perhaps God is using to cause us to create within us a need to act, because it may just be something that's outside of our own personal interest. It may be a larger thing that God is doing, and He's calling you, and perhaps He's calling me to respond to an emotional response, to bring action to it, to get something done in God's full plan and purposes, not so much our own, much like Nehemiah. Selwyn goes on to say about our emotions, and we have to be careful. You've heard me preach many times about being controlled by our emotions. That is not the point here. The point here is that we use our emotions. We use our emotions perhaps to jumpstart the spirit within us. Let God use those emotions to direct us, to point us, to put us in a right place where we can then rely on the Spirit, trust in the Spirit, and act upon that which is God, that which God is causing us to have an emotional response to. Selwyn says we're not to wallow in these emotions, but we are to be willing to feel them, to understand them, to embrace them. For acknowledged emotions, for unacknowledged emotions cause trouble. If we don't respond, if we don't somehow have an emotional response, we just become, we just become kind of lifeless and can create trouble because we don't do anything. Integrity, he says, requires that whatever is true must be faced, and that includes troublesome emotions. Nehemiah was no less godly because he gave vent to his emotions. It's the healthy thing to do. Some people would have a say and pat us on the back and say, oh, you don't need to worry about the walls, Nehemiah. God will take care of the walls. Well, God is trying to take care of the walls, and He's trying to use Nehemiah, and sometimes our Christianese approach to responding to someone's emotional response to something is to basically run contrary to God's will, and telling someone not to worry, tell someone not to respond to your emotions, just relax and all that. You don't need to worry about it. God's going to take care of it, and all the while God's trying to take care of it through your sense of emotions. Does any of this make sense? So we're not to be led by our emotions, but we allow our emotions to point us, perhaps to open up doors or venues or avenues by which God, by the Holy Spirit, can move us into action for the purposes of God. Selwyn reminds us, and I would remind us as well, says, look around you today and see things as they are, not as you would like them to be. Are you aware of any broken down walls? Church, my gosh, we're in the midst of this pandemic. We're in the midst of, I hate to even bring it up, but we're in the midst of all this conflict and controversy regarding the governance, not the politics. Please understand this, not but the governance of our nation. These walls that have defined us over the centuries are being etched away, and they need to be repaired. And so maybe an emotional response that we may be having, maybe if we stopped for a moment and allowed the Spirit to take charge, we might find that God is wanting to move us in another direction. Maybe we're not to be so adversarial, but we're supposed to be Spirit-led, discern the Spirit, discern what God is calling you or me to do in our response to what's going on. And I think that's the lesson to be learned, to protect the walls that define us as who we are, as a nation, or as Christians, and as individuals and human beings. He says the walls of your devotional life, perhaps, your family, your church. Is there something for which you should be grieving at this moment?